Okay. Before I get started, let me introduce everybody. I'm Becky Anthony, and we're going to be taking turns during the presentation. Travis Pritchard and Leslie Merrick will also be presenting, and they will be taking turns throughout this presentation. So back to federal requirements. So we're required to assess Oregon's water quality every 2 years, which is called the Integrated Report. It combines Section 305B of the Clean Water Act and Section 303D. Section 305B is just a status of water quality across Oregon, and Section 303D is what is more commonly referred to as the 303D list or the impaired waters list. And the 303D list are those waters where a TMDL is required to be developed. We're also required to go out for public comment during this draft list, which is where we're at right now. We went out at the beginning of October. The public comment period opened, and it will be open until December 2nd. And then when we finalize the report, we're required to submit to EPA using a new reporting system, which is called ATTAINS. And the difference in how we report is that our impairments are based on impairment of a beneficial use, a use that's not supported, as opposed to just what criteria is not meeting, or what parameter is not meeting its criteria. And these findings will be made public on EPA's website, which they are working on right now. It's going to be called How's My Waterway, and you will be able to access the findings through EPA's website probably within the next few months is when they're going to try and launch that. So in addition to our federal requirements, we also have some state requirements. We're required to assess the attainment of beneficial uses of waters of the state. We're also required to go out to peer review when we're developing our methodologies. For any methodology that has different alternatives, we have to determine whether or not the method we chose is scientifically and technically defensible. We were required to go out to public comment for the methodology, which we went out for comment in 2018, and it was finalized in the fall of 2018. And we're also required to brief the UQC on our methods, which we did last year. So I'm just going to do a quick run-through of what the process is for developing the integrated report. So the first thing we have to do is solicit data. And we had a data call last year, which was open for 84 days, and it closed on July 25th, 2018, where we requested data for the period of record from January 1st, 2008 through December 31st, 2017. So we did a 10-year data window for our data call. We're also, at the same time, and actually prior to our data call, we were required to develop a credible data policy and listing methodology, and that is our 2018 assessment methodology, where we updated and revised the methods we use to determine whether or not water bodies are supporting their beneficial uses and whether or not they are attaining their narrative or their numeric criteria, and that is laid out in our 2018 assessment methodology. The next step is assembling and evaluating all that data. So we assembled all of the data we received from the data call, and then we assessed that data against our methodologies to determine whether or not water bodies were meeting the criteria assigned to them and supporting their beneficial uses. And then the final step in the integrated report process is the actual report. And in this case, it's not a written report, it's a reporting of the status of water across the state, and that is the combination of the 305B and the 303D list. Just a summary and a quick run through of what the categories are. We don't use Category 1 here in Oregon. Category 2 is that the beneficial uses that we assessed are supporting their criteria. So that is our category for it's attaining its standards. Category 3 means we do not have enough data to determine whether or not the use is supported. And we have some subcategories of Category 3 to kind of highlight why we cannot determine that. For Category 4, is a water body that is impaired and a TMDL has either been developed or is not required. And in those cases, that would be a Category 4B, where some other plan is in place instead of a TMDL to meet water quality criteria, or a Category 4C, which means that it's impaired by pollution instead of a pollutant. And these 4C categories are things like flow modification or habitat modification. And then Category 5 is that a water is considered to be impaired. It's not meeting its criteria, supporting its beneficial uses, and a TMDL is required. So we made some updates to the integrated report process. The last integrated report that was completed was our 2012 integrated report, which actually got finalized in December of 2018. And so a lot of the updates hopefully will make it easier for us to do this reporting every 2 years. We made some updates to our data management. We mapped our water quality standards and the criteria, which you'll hear about later. We updated our reporting segments and how we piece out the water bodies that we assess, and we improved our assessment methods for both listing, and we created a new delisting method. All right, Travis is going to take over now and talk about the segmentation.
Hi, everybody. One of the biggest changes we made to this integrated report from previous reports is the creation of fixed assessment units. Part of this was driven by changing our stream layer, where we based our streams off of, from an older LOID lower resolution stream layer, and you can see on the left the defined segments we had in 2012. In 2018-2020, we moved to map our water bodies on the newer high-resolution NHD stream layer, and we, as you can see, the difference in resolution between the map on the right and the map on the left. In order to classify all of the waters of the state, we changed from a segment methodology to a fixed assessment unit, and I can talk a little bit about the assessment unit. Previously, the assessment unit, or the segments, were divided kind of chaotically, and every cycle and by every pollutant, they were created kind of on an ad hoc basis depending on what monitoring location we had. So what we ended up with is a series of overlapping segments, both in time and by parameter. And on the image on the left here, you can see a section of the Powder River in 2012, and you can see multiple overlapping segments that are not consistent in length at all, and that's by pollutant. We wanted to move away from that kind of chaotic structure and move to a fixed assessment unit. And so we divided all of the waters identified in the NHD layer into assessment units by a rules-based structure. And so moving from the fixed assessment units on the right, you can see that segments have moved into 13 new assessment units. We have 5 different types of assessment units. These types are rivers and streams, watershed units, water bodies, coastlines, and Oregon territorial waters. One thing I want to point out is these assessment units were created before we ever looked at any sort of data. And so these were created based on trying to get similar hydrologies and most importantly, just fixed in time. They're not going to change. The first type of assessment unit we have is our river and stream units. These represent medium to large streams and rivers. So if you're familiar with Strahler stream order, these would be 5th order and higher streams. They were divided based off a tiered process. So first we divided by a change in designated use. And so if I do this little arrow, You can see right here we have a change in use. So downstream of that point, there's no domestic water supply uses because that's classified as an estuary. So that was a break. We also break on stream order change. So you can see at this location right here, we have two tributaries coming in, come together right there, and you create a higher order stream. So that represents a breaking point for that assessment unit. When neither one of those broke the RiverStream unit up, we wanted to move away from where we had previously of mouth to headwater, very large segments. We wanted to break that up, and so you can see we have kind of right here, we have broken up by a HUC 10 boundary, which is a watershed boundary. Zero out of the way. We've divided our smaller water or streams into watershed units. So these represent our headwater smaller order streams, so it'd be smaller stream order 4 or smaller. These are broken by sub-watershed, or what's identified in the NHD layer as the HUC 12 boundary. Our reasoning behind grouping water bodies like this is we wanted to be able to classify all of the waters identified in the high-res NHD layer, but we needed some way of maintaining a reasonable amount of data to manage and assess. If we had divided all of these smaller streams up in the same way that we did rivers and stream units, we would end up with about 3.5 million assessment units, and that just didn't work from a management perspective. So to create these watershed units, an image that's missing here, so I can use. In our, so all of the data within this HUC 12 sub-watershed boundary right here, all the data within there gets grouped together and gets assessed as one cohesive unit. An important thing to realize is that the HUC 12 boundary, or the sub-watershed boundary represents the smallest identified watershed level in Oregon in the NHD layer. We have two different types of water body assessment units. Lakes and reservoirs represent 20 hectares or larger. And we were planning on adding smaller water bodies as data becomes available. This is just kind of the data that we had to identify. And we have also identified estuary assessment units based on CMEX state classification. So that's the Coastal and Marine Ecological Classification Standard. This is a relatively newer way of delineating estuaries that doesn't exactly match up with some of our water quality criteria. So these estuaries have been further divided by applicable bacteria criteria. So where there's a change in criteria from freshwater contact to saltwater contact, we broke those assessment units up there also to make assessing them make more sense. We also have coastline assessment units, and so where we had OHA and EPA designations from other projects, we went ahead and used those in delineating our coastline assessments. And where we didn't have those, they were created by visually delineating from major feature to major feature. We end up with about 134, I believe, coastline units in the state. And we also created 9 ocean assessment units representing Oregon territorial waters. So this is marine waters 3 miles offshore. These were further broken by HUC 8 boundaries, which we inherited from the NHD also. As you're going through and utilizing the tools and in your own work, I wanted to give kind of an anatomy of an assessment unit ID. So this is the way we identify assessment units. And they have a 5-part code to them. So the first part represents a state identifier. In this case, all of ours are going to be Oregon. Then we have the second segment identifies what type of assessment unit that is, so whether it's a stream or river, lake or reservoir, ocean, etc. That third section is our HUC 10, or for a watershed unit, a HUC 12 designator to kind of say what watershed it's in. That fourth section is a beneficial use code, so that digit, 02 will represent a unique series of applicable designated uses for that site, which helps us in our assessment figure out what standards apply. And then we have a 5-digit unique identifier, and so this last identifier is unique to each individual assessment unit. So if you need to search through our tools or search through the maps that we're going to talk about in a little bit, you don't have to remember that 30-digit code. You just have to use those last 6 digits. Before we move on from the assessment units, the kind of main points that we wanted everyone to know on this is the assessment units were created based on rules that are based on the hydrology and not based on the data that we had. All of the data within an assessment unit gets pooled together, and that assessment unit gets assessed as one cohesive unit, and they're intended to they tend to be fixed in time and not change. This will help us both from a management perspective of tracking kind of the status moving forward, but also it'll make it a lot simpler for us to do delistings where appropriate, because we'll know, we'll have a like comparison to like comparison. I'm going to turn it over to Leslie to talk about how we moved from the 2012 integrated report into our new assessment unit regime.
Thanks, Travis. Good morning, everybody. So I am going to give you guys information of how we took the old list. So DEQ's been doing integrated reports since about the late 80s, and the culmination of that is our 2012 effective list right now, but we made all these changes specifically to our assessment units, and under EPA's guidance, we were advised that we needed to move forward all impaired waters, which would be categories 4 and 5, and those needed to be carried forward on our new assessment unit framework until attainment was demonstrated. So what we're calling that process is the crosswalk of the 2012 list. We defined a couple goals before we started this process. 1, to be data-driven, 2, to be consistent, and 3, to be transparent, so we could be able to explain to you folks how we did that. In looking at what we had available to work with, we determined 2 methods to do this crosswalk, one being using monitoring location or station information when that was available, and I'll walk through some examples of these. And then the other method was to do kind of a spatial, if we did not have any information on the monitoring location that the listing originated from, then we would take the full spatial extent of the old listing and move it forward on our new assessment unit framework. So I'm just going to run through a couple of examples. So this is kind of a station, an ideal scenario. In 2012, we had a dissolved oxygen listing. We listed based on 11 monitoring locations, which are shown in green in the slide. We mapped those monitoring locations onto our new assessment units, which are kind of these multicolored lines that you see here. And the result of that was a similar spatial extent from the 2012 segment as our new assessment unit. So whereas we had one segment listed in 2012, we now have about 4 assessment units that was carried forward, but the spatial extent is the same. We have several scenarios where the extent of the old listing got larger. So again, this is by station for a 2012 E. coli listing. It was based on one monitoring location near the mouth of the stream. We plotted that monitoring location onto our new assessment units, and that turned out to be a watershed unit. So in this case, the entire watershed unit was assigned the impaired status based on that monitoring location. We also had several examples of where the extent of an old listing got smaller. So again, using a station, in 2012 we had a 186-mile-long E. coli listing. The monitoring station was up here toward the mouth of the Willamette. We mapped that onto our new assessment unit framework, and this little green line is the assessment unit that it was mapped to. So in this case, the impairment is converted to a 22-mile-long, more localized listing. And based on the 2012, the purple section goes unassessed. If we had new data for these assessment units, we assessed that in 2018. But as it was right now with the crosswalk, that's how that listing was transferred. We also had many examples of listings that we did not have station or monitoring location information for. We had some problems with data management in the past, and in many cases, this was our only information. We had a TMDL, it was approved. We don't know where the location that this listing was based on. We just have a spatial extent. So in this case, we mapped the entire extent of the 2012 listing to our new assessment units. And we now have 4 assessment units listed for excess algae on this previous segment. Another big change in the crosswalk was to remove seasonality from all parameters except for those where the water quality standards specifically include seasonality. So for Oregon DEQ water quality standards, those include dissolved oxygen and temperature, which have a spawning criteria, and all other parameters were assessed year-round. So whereas we used to have pH listings for the fall and summer, that got collapsed into a year-round listing. So if it was listed during any season, it now becomes a year-round listing, and that was based on EPA's recommendation that we could not include seasonality where it was not explicitly laid out in our water quality standards. I think that's all I have.
Okay. Thanks, Leslie.
Sure.
So I'm just going to kind of run through just some overall summary highlights of the draft report, and then we'll kind of we'll take some questions and then walk through how to access the information that we provided in the draft. So just a kind of quick run through what data we assembled for this assessment. Like I said earlier, we had 10 years. We did a 10-year data call from January 1st, 2008 through December 31st, 2017. We had data collected by both Oregon DEQ and volunteer monitoring organizations that we partner with were used in the assessment. We also pulled from publicly accessible databases such as the Water Quality Portal, the National Estuary Research Reserve, and NOAA. And then we held the public call for data where we had a consistent template so we could upload the data into our database. It was open for over 80 days, and 13 entities submitted data to us that we used in this assessment. In addition to the numeric data, that was submitted to us. We also did some looking for other data through the Invasive Species Hotline, through OHA, fish consumption advisories, ODA, shellfish consumption advisories, and then journal articles. And all of the numeric data that we received for this assessment got uploaded into our water quality monitoring data portal, which is called Aquas. And this is just kind of a summary graph of the data we assessed. The green is the continuous data, and the orange is grab data. These are just a grouping of the organizations where we received the data, and you can see that most of the continuous data that we assessed was from the federal agencies, which was temperature data, where we received a lot of data from the U.S. Forest Service and USGS. The grab data was more evenly split between the different organizations. Anybody who's looked at the map may be familiar with this image. Oregon looks very red according to this. I just kind of wanted to give a little explanation for why that may be. The way we have to report to EPA, we have to report any parameter that doesn't attain its criteria. That means its use is not supported. So for example, if we received, so we assessed 140 different parameters. If we assessed 140 parameters for an assessment unit and one of those parameters did not meet its criteria, that meant it was given a Category 5. And so that is the reason why the state looks very red. And a lot of the data that we received was temperature. So this is the map with the temperature listings gone. So the temperature was driving a lot of the aquatic life Category 5 listings in this assessment. This is just a summary by beneficial use impairment. The blue is fish and aquatic life use, which again is driven by a lot of the temperature impairments that we saw. The green is fish consumption, which was driven by our listing of the coastal units for shellfish toxins. And this is just a summary of the top 4 parameters of impairment. The blue, the top impairment that we identified is temperature, followed by dissolved oxygen, biocriteria, and E. coli. And these are the same 4 parameters that led the 2012 impairments. So they are the same. So this is a summary of our attaining, which is in blue, and the orange shows our impairments. And these are for temperature, dissolved oxygen, E. coli, and pH. And you can see the temperature impairments outnumber the attaining assessment units. But as you get to E. coli and pH, there are more assessment units that we assess that attain their criteria than are considered to be impaired. And this is the same graph for metals. So you can see the number of assessment units that attain their metals criteria are much larger than the number that are actually considered to be impaired for metals, such as copper, lead, zinc, and cadmium. This is just a summary by grouping of attaining versus impaired. Attaining is in blue, the impaired is in orange. You can see that as you get more towards the pesticides and the toxics, organics, and inorganics, there are more assessment units that attain their criteria than are considered to be impaired. So we didn't want to just talk about the number of additional listings that we have, but we also wanted to highlight that we are doing a lot of delisting in this assessment. I don't think DEQ had done much delisting in the last 10 years, and so we are proposing to delist these parameter water body segments in this assessment. If we summarize what we are proposing to delist for, the number one parameter that we are proposing to delist is dissolved oxygen, followed by pH, E. coli, and temperature. And one of the major metals that we're proposing to delist a lot of water bodies assessment units is for lead. In previous assessments, the lead criteria is a dissolved criteria, and total lead was used to assess the dissolved criteria. The combination of the total lead and a default hardness value of 25 led to a lot of listings for lead, which we will be proposing to remove in this cycle. We wanted to compare the results from 2018-2020 versus 2012. 2012 is in purple, and the 2018-2020 is in the green color. We have more assessment units that are impaired for temperature, dissolved oxygen, and E. coli, but less assessment units that are considered to be impaired for pH in this assessment. So that is just a general highlight summary of our draft results. And so now we're going to open it up and see if anybody has any questions. All right, so we have several questions. Travis will walk through how to find specific data using the tool. The second question is how are beneficial uses determined? I will go ahead and try to address that one. So the beneficial uses, so we have 13 beneficial uses in Oregon, and back when these uses were designated, either, you guys know, 70s or 80s, the beneficial uses were assigned blanketly to all water bodies where they applied. And so all of the uses were assigned to a water body unless it was determined that that use did not exist. So for example, the domestic water supply use was not assigned to estuaries because estuaries do not have drinking water supply. But otherwise, they were assigned all the other uses. So it was more of a blanket designation, and you have to remove a use to show that it does not exist, as opposed to having specific uses designated individually.
To answer the question about how do we find water quality standards for beneficial uses and see the documentation of where DEQ compared data to them to reach the categorization for a given AL, I will be going over that part after this question session when I demo the new tools. Looks like there's a question about if we did any field. I can't tell if everyone could see the chat or just me, so I'm just reading it out. Looking at the new web-based tool, it appears that several water bodies are depicted that do not exist. Did you do any work to field test the expanded assessment units to verify that they exist? The answer to that is no. We just took in the high-res NHD layer and applied that. Becky, do you want to answer the EPA question?
Yeah, so the next question went to, we expect
I was going to ask maybe
EPA
before you guys jump onto that, then in follow-up on the last answer, given that the comment period is open, are you looking for or asking the public to provide you with data clarifications, especially where water bodies have been piped or farmed over, where they don't actually exist on the new, the new map? Really, if you flip on the aerial photography layer, shows that there's nothing there. What's the right approach to provide you with enough specificity in the comments that you actually can remove non-existent water bodies from that map or from the report?
Okay, so, well, definitely, so you need to provide the name of what water body we have named it, what the assessment unit would be, and then if you could provide the basis for why that our assessment should no longer be applicable. Is there anything else you guys think that should be provided?
I think, just really emphasizing the assessment unit ID, that should get us.
Yeah.
And then, if it's a watershed unit, maybe even a screenshot of kind of
That's what I was going to say.
what line, for lack of a better. Because I know the NHD, kind of took a lot of places where there was water at one point and put line work there. So, and feel free to use the email address provided on this slide to, reach out to us if you're having a hard time getting screenshots or something like that.
Yeah. So I'll answer the question, when do we expect EPA will approve this draft? So the public comment period is open through December. We're hoping to have our response to comments and our draft finalized by early 2020, so hopefully January, February, and then we hope to have EPA's approval by April 1st of 2020.
Becky, what about in the comments for show a particular water body should not be listed? I think we need.
Yeah, so you would need to identify a particular water body, the assessment unit, and then the reason why you don't think it should be listed. And in order to do that, I would first review our methodology to see why we determined it to be listed, and then in response to that, write why you think it should not be listed. And if you have questions about like the method we used or the data we had, feel free to reach out to us and give us a call, and we can help you with that. And we also, so right now, the data we used in the assessment is available. Travis will walk through it, but you can access it through Aquas. We are also trying to upload all of the data onto our website with the criteria that we used so that you will be able to see our assessment process. So why we came to the conclusions we did based on the data that we had.
I don't have exact numbers for the total number of assessment units between 2012 and this draft, but when I demo the tools, I can show you a way of getting a visual representation of that.
I think we added probably about 300 new assessment units, but that's kind of a rough estimate between 2012 and 2018.
And then regarding the question of did we consider ruling out ditches and canals as identified in the NHD high-res layer, the answer is no, we did not consider that. Our kind of operating assumption is everything identified in the high-res NHD layer represents the water of the states.
Based on Oregon's broad definition of waters of the state.
Yeah, and then a kind of corollary is, did you consider whether a listed water body is a jurisdiction water of the state in the listing? Again, we are working assumptions everything in the NHD high-res, with the exception of waters under tribal jurisdiction. We did remove those waters from assessments, but we're operating under the assumption that everything identifies the water of is in Oregon waters of the state.
Yeah, the definition of waters of the state of Oregon is fairly broad, and so we were operating under that assumption.
As far as the crosswalk question is concerned, so again, if we had information on the monitoring location, that was the basis, and that for the crosswalk, and the extent of how that compared to the new assessment units was just based on their kind of structure and anatomy. The crosswalk, I should have mentioned, is a one-time deal. We are keeping these assessment units and should not ever have to do this again. So as far as if there's no new data, that those old segments will remain unassessed until new data is available. I hope I answered that question. If not, feel free to.
No, you did. Thank you.
Okay.
We have a question regarding watershed assessment units. Is it correct that a single data point in one small stream leads to a categorization for all the small streams in a given HUC 12? I guess the answer to that is kinda. We pool all of the data together from an assessment unit and then apply our assessment methodology. So if our assessment methodology, most of them have minimum data requirements. But if there is only one monitoring location providing data, then all of the small streams within that HUC 12 will get the same kind of assessment categorization, so whether or not it's impaired or not impaired. One thing that's important to note is this integrated report represents the kind of beginning of the regulatory process, not the end of the regulatory process. So as things move forward, whether or not it's a permitting issue, a permit needs to be written, or a TMDL written, or some other plan to address that, a kind of deeper dive into the data will happen. This integrated report represents a kind of broad brush assessment, and then as further regulatory actions happen, a deeper look into the data will kind of change things of how that impairment gets regulated.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that, in our frequently asked questions that we have available on the 2018-2020 IR page, we have a question about if you have a permit that discharges to an impaired watershed unit, regarding how that would be, what would happen in the future.
And it all, basically, the short story is, it all kind of depends on the how hydrologically connected the discharge is from where the monitoring locations are. Okay, so this is the 2018-2020 integrated report site on our webpage. It looks a little different than when we screenshot for the presentation, but the important links that we found that there's kind of 4 ways that you can access the integrated report. There's an interactive story map, which represents a kind of a high-level narrative, general public audience-focused presentation. We have an interactive web map that has just an absolute ton of data involved into it. We have an online searchable database that provides the assessment conclusion for each assessed parameter that we did. And then we also have a downloadable GIS geodatabase that kind of is the same information as the other 2-3 links above it, but is able to be integrated into kind of an individual organization's workflow. So I just want to highlight some of these tools. We have here, this is the story map, and like I said, it's a high level. It goes into what is the integrated report, how can I access it, kind of a flow chart of the Clean Water Act structure around this report and where it fits in. And then it also kind of goes into, where the impaired waters, where the delisting's happening, if that loads. And then it breaks it down, the assessments, into kind of by beneficial use support. So we have here our Fish and Aquatic Life, that looks very similar to the full map, but we also have water contact recreation support, if the map would load. And so this kind of gives us, as we report to the EPA, the way that we report is by attainment of our beneficial uses. And so water contact recreation, depending on, for this example, depending on if it's salt water, fresh water, this is an E. coli or enterococcus. We also have fishing, etc. It's pretty high level, and it's got a lot of descriptions in there, so I recommend taking a look. What you folks are probably here for is how to use this interactive web map here. This is what you get when you click on it. The interactive web map, we did not know what kinds of questions that people would be asking when they went looking for this data. And so we kind of took a kitchen sink approach and threw everything we could possibly think of in here to allow people to answer the questions that they might have. So I'm going to kind of zoom in to a relatively random part of the states. This looks like a good one. So you can click on a water body here, and it'll show, highlight the assessment unit that we're talking about. In this case, it's Muddy Creek, and you can see some stats about that assessment unit. So it's, unique identifiers 103838 in this one. It's impaired for its fish and aquatic life use, and what's causing that impairment is dissolved oxygen, spawning biocriteria, or spawning dissolved oxygen, year-round dissolved oxygen, year-round temperature, and biocriteria. And we had a question, but pop up, I kind of missed it. Can someone else? Can you go into a bit more detail about the shift of the 303 delisting being formally based on water quality exceedances? Yeah, I can do it at the end, and okay, we can answer those questions later. You can see what year that assessment unit was first listed, and if we have any assessed attaining uses, it'll be here. And then you can see what kind of overall general parameter groups we did assess, and then whether or not there's an active TMDL for that. Roughly, we had a little bit of issues trying to map those out. So this is an example of an impaired one. An attaining one will be in the green. So here's a watershed unit that is attaining. We only measured pH and nutrients for this one, but they all met criteria, and so we have no impaired uses, and we have documentation of attaining our fishing, private domestic water supply, and public domestic water supply uses here. We can go in, and there's if you click on this layers button, there's a ton of layers in here. So if we wanted to look at what we were proposing to delist, so in this purple we have our proposed delistings. So our example could be here. We have Willamette River segment. It's a relatively long one, but this is being proposed delisting for aquatic life copper and year-round dissolved oxygen. Here's another one. This one is an assessment unit. It's not able to graph. And so this one is year-round temperature proposed being delisting there. If we turn on our draft assessment status again, we can turn on, there was a question about how to see what water quality standards apply for a given water body. This water quality standards layer here represents our new geo-referenced water quality standards database. If any of you are familiar with how we did it before this process, this is pretty much digitizes those PDF maps that we had, where instead of having to kind of use two fingers and figure out what standards apply, here you can click on water body and I'll tell you what the standards. A little hand, because this maps all the waters in the state, you can use a slider to kind of adjust the transparency and makes it a little cleaner to look at. So if we go back to our kind of Muddy Creek, I believe it's here. Up in this bar, you can select, this is assessment status, but this is the criteria that apply to this segment here. criteria is not necessarily consistent within an assessment unit, so their sizes might be will be slightly different. But for this highlighted section here, you can see we have a E. coli is bacteria indicator, cool water is the DO criteria, and with DO spawn dates of January 1st to May 15th. We have an 18-degree temperature criteria because it is mapped under the salmon and trout rearing and migration temperature criteria with no temperature spawning. You can see all of the designated uses for that water body, as well as a big map of which applicable OARs for the criteria there. We also have, if you wanted to compare the 2018-2020 to the 2012 list, this one's a little hard to see, so I'll show you how you can go through and you can change the colors on it. Click here. I can say make these, let's go for like a nice bluish. I'll make the lines a little bigger so you can see it. So you can see this is the 2012 3D list as compared to the red will be the 2018-2020 3D list, so you can see a comparison there. I'm going to review some questions, see if there's anything that I can talk about right now. A number of subcategories, about 3, and how are these defined? I can go over that in the next section. How do we see the assessment category on interactive web map? You can't. So the interactive web map just rolls it up into kind of attaining or impaired. And in the geo database, or not the geo, in the assessment database, which I'm going to go over next, we can talk about, it'll show you what the individual categories are. And it would be helpful if impaired pollutants in the pop-up box are separated into those that we have been addressed by TMDL. Yeah, I agree, and we're kind of trying to work on that layer right now about the TMDLs. Okay, so that is the geo database, and like I said, there's a ton of data in here. You know, hydrography, water quality, you know, facilities and standards. So there's a ton of data, and I recommend exploring that and contacting us if you have any questions. If you want to see the categorizations of the, so let's pick one. Let's go back to that Muddy Creek, if we can find it. Whatever, I'll just pick another random one. We'll pick this one here. Whitejuice Creek. So, oh yeah, no, sorry, that's 2012. Let me take off the 2012. Okay, so if we go back into here, we have the Deschutes River. If we wanted to see what the assessments happen on this assessment unit, so we can remember 102627, we can go into our assessment database here, which I already have up. Oh, looks like I got to reload it. 10267. So if you know your individual assessment unit, 27, you can type that in here, press filter, and this will come up with everything that we monitored for in that assessment unit, what its category is, and then what monitoring locations contributed data for that assessment, and then whether or not we assess that data in 2018 or if it's kind of a whole carryover from a previous assessment. So you can see this assessment unit has a lot of assessments on it. A good way to see kind of what these categories mean is in this instructions tab. We have here all of the different categories and their definition. So within category 3 stands for there's insufficient data to determine whether designated use is supported. So, you know, 3B would be we can't say if one way or another, but some data indicates that there's a possible impairment. 3D is a unique category where a lot of toxics have criteria levels that are below commonly used laboratory detection limits. So when that's the case, we call that a 3D and saying it's not really technologically feasible to assess. But if you wanted clarity on what these categories mean, we can find that in these instructions tab. If you don't have a particular assessment unit that you're interested in and you want to filter by a name, so if you want to do the whole of the, say, Deschutes River, this will pull up all of the assessment units for the Deschutes River and then all of their assessments. So here's one example that didn't have, wasn't assessed in 2018. You can also download this table by clicking on this button. We'll download a CSV of this table here. You can also search by OWRD admin basin. So if you want everything within the, say, north or mid-coast, this will bring up all of the assessments within our mid-coast OWRD admin basin. And then to get data out, so like Becky said, we're working on getting the raw data that we use for assessment on our webpage somehow. We have a series of Excel sheets that can go up, but we're just trying to figure out with our web team how to get it on. In the meantime, you could take these monitoring locations and from Aquas, here's our new ambient water quality monitoring portal. Click on the button, or you can click here, which will give you tutorials and how to access and how to input those monitoring locations in, and then get all of our raw data out. All of the numeric data that we use for assessment is being stored in Aquas. When we're able to figure out how to put the raw data that we use for assessment on our webpage, it'll include things such as what are the criteria that we use to assess against, whether or not an individual value was an excursion of that criteria or not.
If you have questions on that, if you need the data more rapidly than we would be able to get it posted, feel free to contact that email address as well.
Okay, can you explain in detail when category 4C is appropriate? For example, it's related to Lowflow. Becky, can you answer that question?
Yeah, so we, in this assessment, did not apply a category 4C. These are historic listings that moved forward, and a lot of these were done in the early 2000s, and they were based on low flows for fish and aquatic life, I believe. And so these are just, so the ones that are proposed as 4C in this assessment are just historic listings.
And that 4C it's a pollutant, or it's pollution, not a pollution?
Yeah, yeah.
There was a question about, can you search for a specific water body on this map? What if you needed to find Muddy Creek again? Must you scroll around, or you can enter into a search field? The answer is, I don't know what's going on with the map right now, but you can. So in this search field here, you can type in Muddy Creek, and you can see here stream status. Here's all of this. Here's the Muddy Creek Assessment Unit, and if you it'll zoom right back into that Muddy Creek Assessment Unit there. There is also a bunch of filtering tools that you can do. So in the tools, you can go to filter, and if you select as your data source, say the 2018-2020 stream status, you can limit what's being displayed on the map to all these fields. So if you wanted to, for example, see all of the water bodies that were impaired for, let's just say, no, sorry, not impaired use, impairment causes for, say, copper. You can see here, these are, what's in red is all of our copper listings. So if you wanted to kind of explore the data based on parameter as opposed to kind of based on location, using these filters is a good way to do that. You can also add, conditions, and so there's all sorts of things that you can do there. Just gonna refresh that. Okay, looks like we have some more questions. Can you explain whether you've used modeled data versus measured data? If so, is it possible to identify the underlying model using any of these tools? We only assessed on measured data. So we compared data from to the standards using the methodology, which you can find on our website right here. This 2018 assessment methodology document will tell you how the criteria was applied to the data. The fact sheet
with that would be the biocriteria. We use the predator model for macroinvertebrates, which is covered in the methodology.
There's a question about, there are some parameters that DEQ notes were not assessed in 2018. It appears that the previous listings were just carried forward. Is DEQ receptive to reviewing more recent data to assess the previous listings? Well, a little bit of background of that. So, direction from the EPA is once it's on the 303D list, it needs to be carried forward until we can show attainment of the uses. And that process is outlined in the methodology document under the delisting section. So the delisting is the method that we have for moving things off of the list. And we are certainly receptive to reviewing more recent data and are hoping that folks can submit that on our next call for data, which will be, Becky, when are we shooting for that?
We're hoping to do the call for data probably end of the year 2020, beginning of 2021. So we would encourage you to submit the data then, and we could reassess those listings.
We have a comment about, in our area, fish and aquatic life beneficial use is applied to an irrigation ditch, which is screened. It appears the beneficial use criteria is still at a rather broad brush accuracy, while the HUC 12 assessment unit is much finer detail. Will you accept comments on the beneficial use criteria? Yes, we'll accept comments on that, and we have some internal meetings set up to talk about kind of how, what's the process for...
How we would go about removing a use if it was determined that a use did not apply there. Yeah.
Right.
But I would say, just to caveat that we will accept comments on that, but it would not change our proposal for what we are proposing in this go-around unless it was determined in the future that that use was not applicable.
Okay, I just want to understand everything. I just want to make sure I understand. You showed how we can use the water quality layer to see the criteria for reach, but that data you compared to the criteria are not available online. And we need to email you if we want data for specific reach. Is that correct? No, the data, the numeric data that we assessed is online. So if you look at an assessment unit, so for example, we have in this assessment unit, this is a coastal unit, and it's category 2, so it's currently attaining or it's meeting its Enterococcus criteria. You can see what data we use to assess that currently, right now, by searching aquams, searching in this tool these monitoring locations here, if that makes sense. I'm not going to do necessarily a demo of how to get the data out of aquams, but within the ambient water quality monitoring portal, we have tutorials and videos for how to find specific data within aquams. Hopefully soon we'll have some Excel spreadsheets of the raw assessment data, which is going to be the same data that's in aquams, just with a couple added fields to it, up on our website, and so you'll be able to pull that and look. But currently you can access the data through aquams. On the slide that I just put up, there's the email for where to submit comments. You can also mail them to us at the address there. This information is also on the integrated report website, and we're accepting comments up through December 2nd.
So thanks, everybody. Thanks for
thank you.
participating.
And you also, one last thing, you're also free to email that email address with general questions also, and we will try to help you work through them so we can get the best comments possible. And one last thing, thank you for participating. For the 4 people that are still on, we have a few more kind of live sessions, which will be the same presentation, followed by some computer setup, so for a little hands-on working through the tools.